Oh la la. Where to begin? I've just finished watching House of the Dragon. I have my notes. This is going to be a lot less scripted than my other videos, but let's just get into it. Overall, I liked it. Overall. Let's start with what I'm not talking about in this video. I'm not going to be talking much about the writing, the scripting, the direction, because that is for other people to do. What I am going to be focusing on is the production design, specifically the use of historical aesthetics in the production design of House of the Dragon. Because the use of historical design in fantasy, specifically in costuming and sets and props, is a special interest of mine. You can see a whole video I made about the use of historical aesthetics in Harry Potter on my channel. Now, I am a student of art history. Specifically, I'm a medievalist. And I've always loved fantasy films and TV, so the meeting of those two interests is my acute attention to detail when it comes to how fantasy media uses historical motifs to build worlds and what it says about the nature of the storytelling. Huge disclaimer. This video is not going to be how historically accurate was the production design of House of the Dragon, because, plot twist, House of the Dragon is a fantasy. I am very aware of that fact. It is not set in a real time or place, it is set in a fantasy world, and I'm also very aware of the other times in which this dialogue about historical accuracy and the Game of Thrones franchise has been mobilized in really problematic ways. Namely, way back when the original series Game of Thrones was airing, there was a lot of very justified criticism about the use of sexual violence against female characters in the show. Sexual violence was used in the writing of the show as character motivation and, quite frankly, as shock factor, as a way to get people to watch and a way to generate media about the show. And when this was all happening, there was a completely bonkers argument on the side of people defending this use of sexual violence, where people were saying it was just like that back then. When dragons existed. That situation with the original Game of Thrones series is a really good example of why it is not a good idea to try and hold fantasy stories to any form of historical accuracy, because it fails to understand that the plot and characters of any text are always a reflection of the time they are written rather than the time that they draw inspiration from. So while we should not be talking about historical accuracy when it comes to fantasy texts, historical aesthetics in film and TV do matter, but for a different reason. And that is that they are excellent storytelling devices. So, how well does the historically inspired production design of House of the Dragon stack up? Let's get into it. Now, obviously, the original Game of Thrones series has a medieval-inspired aesthetic. There are castles and knights, sailing ships, there's no electricity, there's a primitive kind of form of explosives. Everything is very much constructed out of textiles, stonework, metalwork, and of course the broad narrative of the show and the books that it's based on is inspired by medieval history and the whole legacy of the fantasy genre, which is steeped in medievalisms. I thought it was really interesting when I found this article where Jim Clay, the production designer of House of the Dragon, said he was aiming to take the world of Game of Thrones back in time to its Byzantine roots. The Byzantine Empire, for anyone who doesn't know, was essentially the continuation of the Roman Empire after the fall of Rome. Its capital was Constantinople, now Istanbul. Its religion was mostly Christian, and often in grand narratives about world history, it's seen as the link between antiquity and the European Middle Ages and then the Renaissance. That's a very broad overview, not at all comprehensive. Now, I think that taking inspiration from the Byzantine Empire is a brilliant idea for a series like House of the Dragon because it looks very different. I think to a general audience, Byzantine aesthetics, whether it's in architecture or costume design, are distinguishable from a kind of Gothic medieval look. I do really like how the production designer says that he took inspiration from really early medieval Spanish architecture in designing these complex sets for inside the Red Keep in King's Landing. There's a lot of Romanesque arches happening. I think that that is pulled off really well. The infamous erotic frescoes on the walls of the Red Keep are a great nod to Pompeii. But where House of the Dragon falls short for me is in what I see to be a bit of a disconnect between the costuming and the set design. My biggest gripe is with the men's costumes, surprisingly. It's not usually the men's costumes that are such an obvious target, but for me, they stood out like a sore thumb. And I want to primarily talk about armor. A full silver metal suit of armor is a 15th century invention. Jousting is a 13th century sport. This whole scene in the first episode is incredibly high Middle Ages. It's giving courtly love. It's giving King Arthur. It's giving even 19th century interpretations of the high Middle Ages. It is not giving 200 years before medieval Game of Thrones. As a side note, additionally, Matt Smith's dragon suit of armor sucks. He looks ridiculous. Just like purely from like a design perspective, taking the historical aspect out of it completely, he looks ridiculous. Apparently it was made of light plastic and it looks like shit. But back to the main point. The armor in House of the Dragon looks more modern than most of the armor in the original Game of Thrones series. In the original series, very few people are wearing full suits of armor. Most of the time it's partial armor on the shoulders, protecting wrists, helmets. A lot of the men in Game of Thrones are simply just wearing protective leather, which was the most common form of protective armor in the Middle Ages. Makes total sense. But these kind of gleaming, very fine, delicate metalwork suits of armor from House of the Dragon on the King's Guard just look completely out of place to me in this universe. I just don't believe that this world that we're looking at would have craftspeople able to produce something like that. There's not even any kind of like fantasy excuse. Like, I don't know, when you look at some of the kind of costuming in Lord of the Rings on the elves, it kind of makes sense that it's like a little over the top, like very fine, very detailed, because they're fucking elves, they're magical. But these are meant to be humans with human skills in a kind of pre-modern, ancient world. These suits of armor just don't make sense. There is possibly something to be said about the idea that in House of the Dragon, we're meant to be seeing the Targaryen dynasty at its peak. They're the wealthiest and most powerful they've ever been. So there's meant to be a sense of opulence about the costuming and the sets. And you could argue perhaps that this armor shows a level of craftsmanship that's been lost by the time we get to the original series. But I think that's a huge stretch. We can, of course, totally blame the scriptwriters for including a jousting scene, or perhaps we can blame George R.R. Martin. I don't know who came up with that. Jousting is just so much more modern than most people realize, I think. But let's talk about the women's clothing now. Overall, I think the silhouettes and the styles are better than the men's costumes. The necklines are sometimes a real hit, sometimes a miss. This color, it feels completely out of place with the rest of the costuming to me. Much more like a gown from like maybe the 16th, 17th centuries. I'm not a costuming expert. Rhaenyra's coronation look to me is excellent. I think that this look perfectly encapsulates the Byzantine inspiration. The shape of the crown that she's wearing, the detailing on the dress, and the shape of the dress overall is excellent. Reminds me so much of Byzantine mosaics. And what I love about it is that you can't really imagine anyone in the original series 200 years later wearing this same outfit. It looks ancient and I love it. The infamous green dress on Alicent Hightower. Overall, Alicent's dresses are much more modern than Rhaenyra's, and I think this does serve a really good purpose in the story. It does help to indicate this kind of new money, new power of the Hightower family versus the kind of ancient power of Rhaenyra's Targaryen lineage. Most of Rhaenyra's costumes feel a lot more Byzantine, and most of Alicent's feel a lot more high Middle Ages, if not even kind of Renaissance. And I think that does serve a plot character development purpose, which I like. I did not like the way that they started dressing Alicent like Cersei in the final few episodes, especially since they're clearly trying to parallel Cersei's sort of austerity by giving Alicent this kind of religious fundamentalist zeal. I just thought that it was a little lazy to give Alicent the same kind of costuming aesthetic that Cersei had in the original series, just to show that she's kind of embodying power now in the narrative. Like they didn't have to do that. So I thought it was really interesting that the costume designer for House of the Dragon is Janie Tamine, who is famous for doing 6 of the Harry Potter films. And I loved her work in Harry Potter. She's definitely a brilliant costume designer. I thought it was interesting though that in this interview about House of the Dragon, she said that she took inspiration from both Renaissance and Byzantine eras. And there's this quote from her where she says, "This show is set 200 years before something which doesn't exist. It's not specifically historical, so we wanted references to medieval times, but really the sky was the limit." This is a fair enough statement. House of the Dragon is a fantasy. And obviously, as I've said before, it does not have to be historically accurate. My critique here about the costuming is that they do sometimes feel inconsistent with the sets and the world that's being constructed more broadly, especially for a show that is relying so heavily on conveying the passing of time, whether it's the fact that it's a prequel to the original series or the multiple time jumps that they do within the actual series itself. Time and conveying the passage of time visually is super important to this show. And I really believe that with better costume design and better production design and a more cohesive ancient look, we wouldn't need that horribly patronizing exposition at the beginning of the first episode where they use text on screen to literally spell it out for us that we are 172 years before Daenerys is born. And I know they're probably going for like, make it as easy as possible for the most people to watch. I get that, but like audiences aren't that dumb. I think the prologue was a nice touch, having Rhaenyra narrate a little bit of family history and to show it. It's a little on the nose, like it's not clever, but it is clear. But even the prologue could be avoided, I think, with a more cohesive production design. What I would have loved to have seen would be a King's Landing and a Targaryen dynasty that look immediately to an everyday viewer to be 200 years older than the original series. Because a lot can change in 200 years. I do appreciate how the Red Keep looks kind of shinier and cleaner than it did in the original series, showing perhaps that it's been like newly built. It would have been nice to see it before this particularly Gothic edition. Seeing the Red Keep stripped back to its Roman and Byzantine roots. I don't want to see any pointed arches. I want to see rounded Romanesque arches. I want to see thick columns. I want to see lower ceilings. The heaviness of antique architecture could really shine here. There are some really nice subtle details in this dating back of the Red Keep. The columns in the Iron Throne Room are very different. They've got these kinds of, I think they're relief carvings on them, as opposed to the original series where they had these kind of romantic vines climbing up them. But overall, I feel like details like this are not really noticeable to a general audience. And in terms of costuming, if they really wanted to set historical precedent to the Game of Thrones world, it would have been great to see them in truly antique looking clothing. Like, why aren't they all dressed more like Rhaenyra at her coronation? It also would have been nice to see more of this kind of hand of the maker involved. There's a handmade feel to ancient jewelry and textiles that's really lacking, I think, in these costumes. We get to see that kind of physicality in all the melted down swords in the throne room. Like, you can see how it's been welded, but that handmade feel is just not present in most of the costuming and metal work, and especially not in those suits of armor. So that's it. That's my review. A very broad one, but I just wanted to share my thoughts. If you like this video, I also have a video about the historical aesthetics in the Harry Potter film series, and I'll put a link down below. I also make videos about visual culture and history, so subscribe if you want to see more. Okay, bye.